Mia, what's going on? Why are you being so harsh with your brother? Don't you remember everything we've done for you? If it weren't for us, you wouldn't even be where you are today.
Mom, please listen to me first.
You're the oldest. It's your job to take care of your brother. That's how family works.
I just want to say that he should feel grateful for the money I gave him.
If you're keeping track of every penny you've sent home, then tell me. I'll find a way to pay you back. I'll work extra hours, take on side jobs, whatever it takes.
It's not my mean. Mom. My name is Mia. I'm 30 years old and live in a mid-sized city on the East Coast. From the outside, my life seems pretty settled, a steady office job, a loving husband, and a toddler who keeps me on my toes. But every so often, my thoughts wander back to my family, to my past, and to the dynamic I have with my younger brother. I'm the oldest child, 10 years older than my brother, and that age gap shaped our relationship from the start. When he was born, I was just 10 years old myself. Suddenly, I wasn't just a kid anymore. I was a big sister, a caretaker, and, in many ways, a third parent. Our parents both worked long hours in a nearby factory. They left the house early in the morning and didn't return until late at night. This left me in charge of a lot of things, watching my brother, keeping the house in order, and sometimes even putting together simple meals. Our parents both worked long hours in a nearby factory. They left the house early in the morning and didn't return until late at night. This left me in charge of a lot of things, watching my brother, keeping the house in order, and sometimes even putting together simple meals. We didn't have much back then. New clothes or toys were rare, and most of what I had were hand-me-downs from neighbors or family friends. I didn't complain because I knew that was just the way things were. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little to see other kids at school with shiny new backpacks or trendy sneakers while I made do with what I had. I remember my 12th birthday vividly. My parents had promised they'd come home early to celebrate, and I spent the whole day cleaning the house and baking a few cookies as a treat. But then they called to say they'd been asked to work late at the factory. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, blowing out the candle on a single cookie while holding my sleeping baby brother. As my brother got older, things started to look up financially. The factory got a big contract, and my parents' paychecks grew. I was happy for them and grateful that life was getting easier. But at the same time, I couldn't help but notice how different my brother's childhood was from mine. He got new toys for Christmas instead of hand-me-downs. When he needed clothes, they bought him exactly what he wanted. On weekends, my parents would take him out, to the park, to the store, even to the movies. While I stayed home to finish chores, I didn't resent my brother. It wasn't his fault. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little to see the stark difference between us. I couldn't help but think, why wasn't it like that for me? Despite the differences, I loved my brother deeply. I was always there for him, helping with his homework, standing up for him when kids picked on him at school, and even taking the blame for things he did wrong. Once, he accidentally broke one of Mom's favorite vases. Without hesitation, I told her I'd done it because I couldn't bear to see him get in trouble. That's just how it was. I protected him, no matter what. Looking back, I realize I put a lot of pressure on myself. I wanted him to have a better childhood than I did, even if it meant sacrificing my own time, energy, and happiness. But those sacrifices left a mark on me, and they created an invisible divide between my parents, my brother, and me. I didn't see it at the time, but it's something I think about a lot now as an adult. When I left for college, everything changed. I moved to a different city, juggling classes and part-time jobs to make ends meet. My parents couldn't afford to help with tuition, so I had to figure things out on my own. Despite that, I sent home as much money as I could to help with bills or emergencies. It wasn't easy, but I told myself it was my responsibility as the eldest. At first, I didn't mind. It felt good to contribute, to know I was helping lighten the load for my parents. But as the years went on, I started to feel like my sacrifices weren't being noticed, or worse, they were being taken for granted. Every phone call from home was less about how I was doing and more about what they needed from me. "I'm proud of you," Mom would say. But it was often followed by, "We're a little short on rent this month. Could you send something over?" I'd always say yes, even if it meant cutting back on my own expenses. I didn't see it as an option to say no. After graduating from college and starting my first job, I felt a sense of relief. The years of balancing part-time work, studying, and sending money home were behind me, or so I thought. I was eager to start building my own life while still supporting my family when they needed it. But just a few months after landing my job, I got a call from my mom. She started the conversation warmly, asking about my new job and how I was settling into life after college. But then her tone shifted. "Mia," she said hesitantly, "there's something we need to talk about." I braced myself, knowing that this couldn't be good. "You know how we've always tried to support you, even when things were tight," she continued. "Well, when you started college, we had to take out a loan to make sure you could stay in school. It wasn't a big deal at the time, we just wanted you to succeed. But now, it's time to pay it back." I was stunned. In all the years I'd been in college, they'd never once mentioned this loan. I had assumed that my scholarships, part-time jobs, and the money I sent home had covered most of my expenses. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated before giving me a number. It wasn't astronomical, but it was significant, enough to feel like a punch to the gut. "I know you're just starting out," she added quickly, "but we thought it would be fair for you to take care of it, since it was for your education." Fair. The word lingered in my mind. I couldn't argue with the logic, but it stung nonetheless. For years, I'd sacrificed so much to support my family, and now, instead of being able to breathe, I was being handed another responsibility. "I'll figure it out," I said eventually, swallowing my frustration. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. Part of me wanted to call them back and tell them I couldn't do it, that I had my own bills to pay, my own life to build. But I knew I wouldn't. After years of working tirelessly, I finally managed to pay off the loan my parents had taken out for my education. It was a milestone I had been quietly working toward, and when the final payment cleared, I felt a rare moment of pride, and a glimmer of hope. Maybe now, I thought, I could focus on building a life for myself. Not long after, I got married. My husband, always supportive and understanding, knew about my complicated family dynamic but never let it faze him. Together, we started our own little family, and a year later, we welcomed our son. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my life was moving in the right direction. On my son's first birthday, we decided to keep things simple, just a small gathering with a few close friends and family. The house was decorated with balloons, and I had spent the morning baking a cake shaped like a little train, his favorite toy. As the party was winding down and guests were beginning to leave, my phone rang. It was my mom, and the sound of her sobbing instantly sent a chill through me. "Mia," she cried, her voice frantic, "it's your dad. He's had a heart attack. We're at the hospital. Please come quickly." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. My dad had always been a quiet, stoic man. I couldn't imagine him lying in a hospital bed, vulnerable and weak. Without hesitation, I told my husband to watch over our son and rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, my mom was pacing the waiting room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She ran to me, clutching my arms. "Mia, I don't know what to do," she said between sobs. "The doctor said he needs surgery. They're asking for a deposit, but we don't have the money." I didn't even hesitate. "It's okay, Mom. I'll take care of it." The days that followed were a blur. Between negotiating with the hospital, filling out paperwork, and talking to the doctors, I barely had time to process what was happening. I stayed at the hospital late into the night, sometimes sleeping in the waiting room, while my mom sat silently by my dad's bedside. My husband took over caring for our son while I was away, but the weight of balancing both my own family and my parents was overwhelming. I couldn't help but feel like I was slipping back into a familiar role, the one who fixed everything, who took care of everyone, who held it all together. When my dad was finally discharged, the relief was short-lived. The hospital bills were staggering, and the aftercare, medications, follow-ups, a special diet, was yet another responsibility added to my plate. My mom, grateful but overwhelmed, often called me for advice or help managing my dad's recovery. One night, after putting my son to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my husband, staring at the growing pile of hospital invoices and receipts. "I don't know how much more I can do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Every time I think I'm done, something else comes up. First the loan, now this. When does it stop?" He reached across the table, taking my hand. "You've done so much already, Mia," he said gently. "But you need to figure out where to draw the line. You can't keep giving everything without leaving anything for yourself or for us." I nodded, but deep down, I didn't know if I could stop. This was my family. No matter how exhausted or overwhelmed I felt, I couldn't turn my back on them, not when they needed me the most. Meanwhile, my younger brother, now a teenager, was thriving in ways I never got to. He had new clothes for school, a gaming console, and even a car when he turned 16. I wasn't angry at him, how could I be? He didn't ask for those things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my parents treated him differently. They were more lenient with him, more willing to bend over backward to make him happy. What frustrated me most was the lack of acknowledgement. My parents rarely mentioned the sacrifices I was making to support the family. To them, it was just what I was supposed to do as the eldest. And my brother? He was too young to understand the weight I was carrying. Things came to a head after my brother started college. My parents had been clear that I'd help cover his tuition, and I agreed because, again, it felt like the right thing to do. But over time, the financial strain became unbearable. One evening, I got a call from my brother. "Hey, I need money for textbooks," he said casually. "Mom said you'd take care of it." There was no please, no thank you, just an expectation that I'd come through. Something inside me snapped. "Do you have any idea what I've done for you?" I said, my voice shaking. "I've worked 2 jobs in college, sent money home, skipped vacations, and put off saving for my own family, all for you and Mom and Dad. And you can't even say thank you?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he mumbled, "I didn't mean to make you upset." But it wasn't just about him. It was about years of feeling unappreciated, years of putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. Not long after that, my mom called. Her voice was sharp, and I could tell she was upset. "Mia, what's going on? Why are you being so harsh with your brother? Don't you remember everything we've done for you? If it weren't for us, you wouldn't even be where you are today." I was stunned. Did she really not see what I had been doing for the family all these years? "You're the oldest," she continued. "It's your job to take care of your brother. That's how family works. If you're keeping track of every penny you've sent home, then tell me. I'll find a way to pay you back. I'll work extra hours, take on side jobs, whatever it takes." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. She didn't understand that it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, about feeling like I was being treated as an ATM instead of a daughter. After the call, I sat alone for a long time, trying to make sense of everything. I wasn't angry at my mom, but I was deeply hurt. I realized that, in her eyes, my sacrifices were just part of being the eldest child. She didn't see them as sacrifices at all, just responsibilities I had to bear. For the first time, I began to question whether I had done the right thing all these years. Had I been helping out of love, or had I been guilt into it? And if I stopped, would it mean I didn't care about my family anymore? After that phone call with my mom, I didn't reach out to my family for an entire month. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, I just couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. Every conversation seemed to revolve around what I could do for them, and I needed time to breathe, to process what I was feeling. For the first time in my life, I put some distance between myself and my family. It felt strange, like I was abandoning them, but at the same time, it was liberating. I focused on my own little family, my husband and son. I spent more time with them, trying to reconnect with the parts of myself I neglected for so long. My husband noticed the change in me. One evening, as we sat on the couch after putting our son to bed, he gently brought it up. "You've been quieter lately," he said, his hand resting on mine. "I know this thing with your family is weighing on you. Do you want to talk about it?" I hesitated. It was hard to put into words how I felt, exhausted, frustrated, guilty. I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough, I admitted. They don't see what I've sacrificed, and when I try to set boundaries, it's like I'm the bad guy. He squeezed my hand. "You've done more for your family than most people would. But maybe it's not about what they see or don't see. Maybe it's about what you need to feel at peace." His words stuck with me. For years, I'd been driven by a sense of duty, by the belief that it was my job to take care of everyone else. But in the process, I'd forgotten to take care of myself. A few days later, my husband suggested something that took me by surprise. "Why don't we visit your parents? Bring the little guy. It doesn't have to be about the past, just a visit, for them to see their grandson." At first, I was reluctant. Part of me worried that going back would reopen old wounds. But another part of me, maybe the part that still longed for connection, thought it might be worth a try. That weekend, we packed up the car and drove to my parents' house. It was a quiet drive, the kind where you're lost in your own thoughts. When we pulled into their driveway, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The door opened before I even had a chance to knock. My mom stood there, her face lighting up the moment she saw my son. "Oh, look at my little grandson," she exclaimed, reaching out to take him from my arms. It was like nothing had ever happened. She didn't bring up the phone call, didn't say a word about the argument. Instead, she showered my son with attention, laughing and playing with him as though everything was fine. My dad was sitting in his recliner, watching with a small smile. "He's getting big," he said, nodding toward my son. We sat down for lunch, and the conversation stayed light, updates on the neighborhood, stories about my brother's classes, little anecdotes about my parents' garden. No one mentioned money, sacrifices, or responsibilities. It was as if the tension from the past month had been swept under the rug. After lunch, my son toddled around the living room, laughing as my dad played peekaboo from behind his recliner. It was the first time I'd seen my dad so engaged in a long while. He wasn't a man of many words, but watching him quietly interact with my son stirred something in me, a flicker of warmth I hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, my mom was in the kitchen, fussing over a batch of cookies she insisted on baking for us to take home. I wandered in to check on her, unsure of how to bridge the unspoken tension that still lingered between us. As she pulled the tray from the oven, she turned to me and said, almost casually, "You know, you used to love these cookies when you were little. I haven't made them in years." Her words caught me off guard. I remembered those cookies, soft, buttery, with just the right amount of sweetness. She used to bake them on rare weekends, when she wasn't working overtime. Back then, it felt like a small celebration in a childhood that didn't have many. "I didn't think you remembered," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She gave me a quick look, her hands busy transferring the cookies to a cooling rack. "Of course I remember, Mia. I remember everything." There was something about the way she said it that made me pause. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the moment passed too quickly, and she was already moving on to something else. After the cookies were packed, I took my son upstairs to my old room for his nap. The room was mostly unchanged, same faded wallpaper, same creaky bed frame. But one thing caught my attention, a small box tucked in the corner of the closet. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it out. Inside were stacks of papers, old photos, and little trinkets I hadn't seen in years. A report card from middle school. A bracelet I'd made in art class. and at the very bottom a handwritten note in my mother's neat, looping script. Mia, you've always been the strong one. One day, I hope you'll know how much that's meant to us. I stared at the note for a long time, my heart caught between sadness and something I couldn't quite name. I hadn't expected this, a glimpse into feelings my mom had never voiced, at least not to me. Later that evening, as we were getting ready to leave, my younger brother arrived. He'd just come home from campus for the weekend, and his energy filled the house the moment he walked in. "Hey, Mia," he said brightly, pulling me into a quick hug. "It's good to see you." For a moment, it felt normal, like we were just siblings catching up. But then he glanced at my husband and added, "So, I was thinking, maybe I could come visit you guys soon? I've been wanting to check out some places in your city," and, he hesitated, then grinned. "Maybe you could help me with a few things?" I knew what he meant. A few things was his way of hinting at more help, probably money, maybe connections, or even just a place to crash for the weekend. I glanced at my mom, who was busy packing leftovers for us, and at my dad, who was entertaining my son. They didn't say anything, but the unspoken expectation was clear. Instead of responding immediately, I smiled and said, "We'll see. Let's talk about it later." The rest of the visit passed without incident, but that moment lingered with me as we drove home. As the city lights came into view, my husband broke the silence. "So, how do you feel?" I looked out the window, watching the familiar streets rush past. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "It was good to see them. But it feels like nothing's really changed. I don't know if it ever will." He nodded, giving me space to think. The truth was, I didn't have an answer. My family was complicated, messy, and full of unspoken expectations that weighed on me. But there were also moments of love, small, quiet gestures like cookies in the kitchen or a note tucked in a box. I didn't know what the future held, whether we'd find a way to balance love and responsibility, or if we'd keep circling the same patterns. But for the first time, I felt like I could face it on my terms. And for now, that was enough.